Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Sarah Meisha Fira Laheba, and I am going to explain about input hypothesis. So input hypothesis is from Krashen's 5 hypotheses, and they are the acquisition learning hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, the monitor, the input hypothesis, and last, the effective filter hypothesis. But we're not going to talk about all these 5 hypotheses, but only input hypothesis. So what does it mean by input hypothesis? The input hypothesis is Krashen's attempt. Stefan Krashen is the one who suggested all the 5 hypotheses that I have mentioned before. So the input hypothesis is Krashen's attempt to explain how the learner acquires a second language and how a second language takes place. And in input hypothesis has these key terms that we have to remember throughout this discussion, and it is comprehensive or comprehension. So in input hypothesis, the comprehensive input is very important, which will lead us to this. We have this I plus 1. I is for the stage of the learner and 1 is for the comprehensible input. And as you can see, I is for the stage of the learner. So I is where the learner is at the moment they are trying to acquire the language. It's like in which level the students are currently in, what kind of knowledge or input that they have had already before the lesson, before they try to acquire the language. And 1 is for the comprehensible input. So each time we learn something, we comprehend something from the the lesson, we have plus 1, which is for the comprehensible input. So I plus 1. I is for the stage of the learner and 1 is for the comprehensible input. And there is also something that we have to keep in our minds about Krashen's input hypothesis, and it is about Krashen's recommendation that speaking should not be taught directly or very soon in the classroom. So teachers should not taught the speaking as soon as the classroom begin, as soon as the course begin, but after the student or the acquirer has obtained enough comprehensible input. So the student has to have a basic knowledge, a comprehensible input first before they learn how to speak in the classroom. But that doesn't mean that we don't have any speaking moment. We can have speaking moment like very simple like good morning or have a nice day or yeah, this kind of stuff, that easy stuff. But actually teach speaking based on particular certain topic is not recommended by Krashen. And here are the characteristics of input hypothesis. First, we have comprehension. As I have stated before, comprehension is very important in input hypothesis. The necessary condition of language acquisition is to understand the code of language. And as you may already know, every language has its own code. Every language has its own pragmatical meaning. That is culturally dependent. They could be culturally dependent. And yeah, and they may vary across language, right? The code may not be the same. So it is important to understand the code of language that you are trying to acquire. Next, we have interest and relevance. That is, the input material has to be interesting and relevant to each other. By relevant mean the input material has to have some clear connection, and by having this connection, the students can connect or the lesson, the material is relevant to what student is trying to learn, it's trying to acquire in the language. It makes it makes the lesson more beneficial, and it makes students learn easier. Also, by having an interest material, student would be less bored, and student would also be less burned out in acquiring the language, because to be honest, acquiring a language is hard. And next we have an grammatical sequence. This is very important in input hypothesis. In input hypothesis, questions do not suggest to teach or to use grammatical structure or translational based method. Instead of teaching the basic of grammatical structures, we can use like real conversation, or real communication, or real example that is authentic, that is referred to real world context. And by teaching grammatical, we don't really have this real world context, and we don't actually understand or comprehend the language as it is, the language as it means to communicate, right? So, and grammatical sequence is one of the characteristics of input hypothesis. And next, we have sufficient quantity. Krashen claims that learning a new language not only needs several exercises, but also needs continuous conversation and reading, which is interesting and full of contents. So, in acquiring a second language based on input hypothesis, we have to do continuous conversation and reading. We have to use the language as much as we can and expose ourselves to the language as much as we can. Of course, after we obtain the comprehensive input first. And yeah, by that being said, that is my explanation about input hypothesis. Now I'm going to review what we have learned. We have learned about input hypothesis. Input hypothesis is about the how learner acquires language and how language takes place. Also, we have some characteristics of input hypothesis, comprehension, interest and relevance, and grammatical sequence, and sufficient quantity. And we also have the term I plus one. I stands for the stage of the learner, and one stands for the comprehensive input. And yeah, that's it for me. If you have any question, feel free to ask by commenting this video, or ask me through my WhatsApp. Thank you so much and have a nice day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.